Ruth, you did a lot of drama within the BBC, but your interest in drama, I think, started when you were at school.
It did, it did. I had a mother who'd always been to the theatre all her life. She was born and brought up in London, and she kind of gave us that love for going to the theatre. So in Chester, where I was brought up, we didn't have what I call a proper theatre, but we had one of those places where they come and bring outside productions.
Yeah.
So every time there was a musical or some big show, she would take us. And we'd watch musicals on television, which I did later in life with my son from the age of about 4. Quite funny, really. But then the Gateway Theatre opened when I was about 15, and they were looking for ushers, to take tickets and stuff. And I started going, and then in return for ushering, you got given tickets to go. And I was someone that would go, they'd ring up and say, we've got no one in the performance tonight, please can you come? And you can laugh and you can clap and you can what have you. And my girlfriend, my best friend at school at the time, was very much pro theatre as well. So we did virtually live there. I was a barmaid there. I worked, doing the ushering and then anything else that we could do. It was wonderful. Sadly, it has closed. Yes, it was rep theatre, proper rep theatre. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting because David Jones, director, who was from the RSC, who I then worked with at the BBC, one of the things he'd said about the Play of the Month on television was it was the rep theatre for the country. So if you couldn't get to a decent theatre to watch a production, you could watch Play of the Month on television. But in our day at the Gateway, it meant that people would go, they didn't care what the play was, they would just go for the cast. And they weren't famous cast in those days, they were just the people that they'd got to know from production to production. So it became a rolling thing, which was phenomenal. And it was one of the advantages of rep theatre, and sadly I think that's gone.
You were interested in theatre, but you weren't interested in acting.
Well, I went to an all-girls school, and I was very short, very plump, and with a very deep voice. So I always got the male parts, and I wasn't terribly good, but I was always in the play, and I absolutely had no idea what I wanted to do. Having volunteered at the theatre and playing truant in my A levels, and then I did go to teachers' training college because my female headmistress said that's all you can do, which was quite bizarre in those days. We're talking about 1971. So I went to Bretton Hall, which was quite a famous college for art, drama, music, in the days when those kind of colleges were, they were specific. Bedford PE College was specific and these colleges were specific. Yep. So I went up there and it was in the wilds of Yorkshire, and I was billeted because there was no room for me to stay in the hall at a miner's cottage in the middle of nowhere. And I was thoroughly depressed because I'd have to get the bus home, so I couldn't do any of the evening stuff and what have you. Anyway, so comes to doing a production, and I immediately thought, well, I'll, go and audition. Oh, no, because they had enough men and enough women by then. You can do, I think it was lighting. Yes, it was lighting. And I can't remember what the play was, and I went up to the lighting desk, and it was the old days where you had lots and lots of sliders and the big pot on either end. Yes. I just loved it. I loved that whole thing, and especially at the end when lights out and then lights up for the applause. And I just thought I had a eureka moment, really. But it coincided with, I was terribly ill. I had pleurisy that winter, and it was the 3-day week, and the college was a coal-fired college, being in Wakefield. So the college shut for the next 3 months, and I was at home, and I said to my parents, I want to go to drama school. I want to do stage management. I don't want to do this anymore. And when I recovered, I worked in the pub that all the theatre people used to go to during the 3-day week, and they'd bring their stands in with a little Jenny so we could keep going. Yes. And then I applied to 3 colleges, Bristol, Old Vic, Lambda and Central, and was accepted at Bristol and Lambda, and I thought I really want to go to London. So I had a bit of the year left, so I went to Israel to a kibbutz for 3 months, and then I came back, worked in the pub, and then I came to London and it was a 15-month course. So you did everything from, building bits of set to lighting to sound. And I was very, very lucky. I worked with the most wonderful people directing. Elizabeth Spriggs, the actress, who I then worked with later at the BBC. She was just to die for, and she directed The American Year, doing Much Ado About Nothing. And I was the DSM, Deputy Stage Manager. So I absolutely loved doing scripts and prompting the actors and stuff like that. But when I finished, we were seconded out. We had to do a placement. And I was placed at the Colosseum. And I hated opera in those days. I had no interest in opera whatsoever. So I was at the Colosseum.
Oh, it was ENO, was it?
It was the ENO, yes. And it was a very famous conductor whose name I now can't remember. But you had to wear a long skirt and you were called by your, Miss Mayorcas and everything. And I absolutely didn't like it at all. And then I worked at a couple of fringe theatres where one's job was to paint the walls with black paint. Because one was called the Open Space in Tottenham Court Road, which you probably remember because
yes.
It's a place where you buy sound and lighting equipment and cameras and all the rest of it. And there was this tiny little theatre. And I was underpaid, overworked. It was ghastly. But I loved the woman who ran it and I loved the director I worked with. And then I went to Stratford East 15, which was also incredibly hard work, very long hours. And I thought, I can't be doing with this. I'm going to apply to television. So I applied to and got what was then called a summer contract. Was it? I think it was called. In studio management. I was interviewed and they said, yes, we'd like to take you on, but we don't have any work at the moment. So go away and do whatever and we'll phone you when we're ready. So after Stratford East 15, I worked at a children's theatre called The Unicorn in Leicester Square, upstairs of the Arts Theatre. And I loved it. It was absolutely amazing and I met lifelong friends there. But I still wasn't called from the BBC and it was the summer of 75 and I just thought, I've had enough of London, I'm going back to Israel. So I went back to the kibbutz and every so often I'd message my mother because we didn't have phones, you had to write. So, can you ring the BBC and see if I've got a job yet? She would and she'd mess back. No, nothing yet. So I came back in October of 76, applied for various jobs which I didn't get. And then I thought, I've got a contract at the BBC. So I phoned Alan Mills.
So they'd given you a contract, had
yes.
they, but said there wasn't any work.
Yes.
Go away
yes.
for the moment.
I've forgotten what they were called. They were those temporary contracts they used to take to cover holiday relief, I think
yes.
it was.
Yes.
And eventually they did call me to go in. I had another interview with them and they sent me away and said, well, we still don't have anything. I remember this vividly on the 30th of October, 75. And then on the 31st, they phoned and said, can you start tomorrow? So 1st of November, 1976,
Yes.
I started at the BBC in studio management. But it wasn't what I'd expected.
What building?
Oh, Television Centre.
Television Centre, right.
And were we on the 4th floor then?
Mm-hmm.
I think we were on the 4th floor. I seem to remember. Or 3rd. One was comedy, definitely. One was plays, which I aspired to.
Yeah.
And then the 6th floor was, all the top people. But studio management for me didn't work at all. I wasn't made for making props for play school or what have you. But I have got a lovely story. There was a wonderful book programme, the name of which I can't remember. Melvyn Bragg was the front man for it. And David Niven, he was doing his book. And my job was to go and get him from the basement, makeup and costume, and take him up to the studio. And I got lost. As one did in one's early days at Television Centre, going round the donut. And we'd gone round once, and he was so sweet. He looked at me and he said, do you need some help? I said, actually, yes. And then as we were going into the studio, he said, how do my lips look? I said, they look fine. He said, it's just that when I get nervous, my lips go white, so I have to bite them to bring them into colour. He was so lovely. And he signed the book for me, so that was very nice.
Yes.
Very nice.
But when you were in the theatre, I mean, there's something about theatres, isn't there? You go in, and there's a smell. It's the smell of Hessian, I think, and the sort of size that people.
The size, yes. Well, that was yes, and smell. But what was my favourite moment in theatre, which became my favourite moment in television drama in a way, was you've set the set and it's before the half and the set looks perfect and there's no actors, no technicians, and it looks absolutely wonderful. And it was the same as soon as I got into television drama, you'd make the set look absolutely beautiful and then mayhem would start with the actors coming in, and the same with the with theatre, really. So my time in what's it called, studio management.
Studio management.
It was. I mean, and I did Newsnight. It wasn't called Newsnight then, and we were down at Lime Grove, which I loved because it smelled like a swimming pool. It was like an old swimming pool.
Lime Grove was wonderful.
It was. It was absolutely wonderful. It was very special, and I didn't really know the history of it then. But it was also that place where there was a wardrobe mending place in there. So, anywhere within the BBC, if there was a problem, they would go there for buttons to be sewn on and hems to be stitched and all the rest of it. I think the workroom then moved up to Television Centre, obviously. But I really wasn't happy, and I don't think I functioned very well. So at the end of my 4 months, my contract was not going to be renewed. And on the very last day, so that would be February, Alan called me in and said, well, I don't know why, but Drama Plays want you. So I thought, oh, okay. So I went off to Mark Shivas, then was the head of plays,
Yes.
wonderful man. And I was seconded onto the most amazing drama directed by Barry Davis. But it was studio and then some film. Lovely designer, fantastic cast. I thought this is what I want to do. It was just amazing.
Now, in those days, of course, television drama was theatre, effectively.
Yes.
It was before the days of everything being on video and
Yes.
very fast cutting and single camera and all that. So
Yes.
you liked the feeling of multi-camera studio drama because it was like theatre.
Well, it was in the sense that I could do what I was good at, which was, in theatre it was DSM, although it was AFM in drama, I would be on the script and on the book. And I did enjoy that. And the absolute master of that was Don Taylor, director, with whom I worked quite a few times. And it was very exciting because it was like choreography with you'd have 2 or 3 cameras in a set, rehearsed till dinner, then you had dinner, came back and recorded. And Don was absolutely phenomenal at the way he worked it out. If we would always go to his house to do the camera script, and he'd very proudly say, it's exactly as I had done it before we even started rehearsing. And a lot of the actors didn't like that because it gave them less fluidity, really, and the option to experiment with things.
Now, tell people about the rehearsal rooms and, what you did before the studio day.
Okay. So the rehearsal rooms were up at North Acton Rehearsals, and I lived in Chiswick, and I would cycle with my old Dutch bike that I had up there. And it was, to have 6 floors that are dedicated to rehearsing, and you'd have anybody, from Sir John Gielgud to Pan's People and what have you. And it was fabulous. And it was, I felt, my domain because I'd come from theatre and rehearsals were what I was all about. And you'd get 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of rehearsing. And also you'd phone the actors to say, can you come in tomorrow and what have you. Got quite a few good stories about this. So the first floor was the dance floor, which is where Top of the Pops was rehearsed and any of the dance shows. And then the other floors were marked out grids, and you'd get your plan from the designer, which would be a scale grid, and it was very easy to mark up. And I did a Doctor Who, and marking out the TARDIS, which is hexagonal. And it was a weekend markup, and I walked in and I was given the dance floor. So there was no way to mark it out. It was absolutely awful. And I rang the then designer and said, what am I going to do? He said, well, get a piece of chalk and a handkerchief and put a dot in the middle and go around it and then get bigger and bigger. I thought, ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So it took me 2 full days to do it, and I was in tears.
To mark it up.
Yes. But markups were fantastic, and the good theatre directors were very good at, or the old television directors were very good at rehearsing. In the studios, I worked with Jack Gold and David Jones, and they all did a very wonderful late night programme. But Jack Gold, again, like Don Taylor, because tape was a valuable resource and cost a lot of money, you were only given so much per production. And at the end of doing this rehearsing and then recording, if any words had been missed or a move had been gone, you didn't get to do the whole scene. You literally would do pickups of a word. And, you know, the good television actors knew how to do this, and the good television directors would have their whole list, and you'd go pick up. And it was fantastic. And some years later, I worked with Dame Peggy Ashcroft doing Little Eyolf by Ibsen. And it was Diana Rigg, Anthony Hopkins, and Dame Peggy. And Dame Peggy knew that this is what happened. So if she didn't like her performance, she would completely fluff it. So they couldn't just do a one-word pickup. She would get away with doing the whole thing again.
Oh, that's a nice story.
Yes.
So the most memorable things were presumably the plays for today and things like that in the studio, were they?
Yes.
Tell us more about those.
So I think I was at the tail end of Play for Today. The thing about being in Plays department was, you know, it was on the 5th floor. There would be the whole the rooms of all the producers, Ken Trodd, Mark Chivas, all these people, Innes Lloyd, and you'd kind of be given a production and you'd do it, but you'd kind of walk round hoping that someone would see you, that you could find out what they were doing next and put your name forward. But I very quickly went on to Louis Marks, who was a wonderful producer of Play of the Month, and worked with this Don Taylor. So we did The Crucible, Arthur Miller, which was just extraordinary. And when we did The Crucible, Eric Porter, who was one of the leads, so we had 4 weeks to rehearse, and Eric Porter, I don't know if you know the play, had one of the big parts. He was Judge Danforth, who was brought in, and he wasn't available for 2 weeks. And Don Taylor simply said, that's fine, we rehearse in play order, Ruth can play Eric Porter.
Yeah.
You know, I'm 5 foot tall, and we had Daniel Massey, who's terribly tall, and Peter Vaughan, who was very tall,
yes,
and me, and we'd be doing these parts at rehearsals, and it was just such fun. And then when it came to doing the studio, the script editor occasionally would come onto the floor and go over to Eric and say, I think you find you said the wrong word there. And Eric said, well, Ruth didn't correct me, and unless she corrects me, I'm not changing it. So, and I loved being on the book, as it was called, and you know, you mark down all the moves. And in those days, of course, with multi-camera, the movements were terribly, terribly important for doing it.
yes, because they cued camera moves and
Absolutely,
and so on.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, the technical rehearsal was another favourite, and it's when you had people with such wonderful expertise, you know, the lighting designer, the set designer, the TM1, the TM2 as they were called,
Yes.
the sound designer, and you'd all sit round the set, the model of the set, and it was just so wonderful. You know, a lighting designer would say to costume, oh, what colour will her dress be so I can get the gels to be the right colour.
You're talking about planning meetings.
Yes. It
Yes.
was joyous.
Yes,
really.
with the cardboard model of the set, which
Yes,
was
yes.
those beautiful things, weren't
They
they?
were.
Yes.
They were.
Now, as an AFM, you were associated with the production right from the beginning.
Yes,
So you sat in on script rehearsals initially,
you did at Northampton rehearsals.
readings rather than
yes.
and then you obviously were there for the rehearsals in the rehearsal room in the Acton Hilton, as
In
it
the
used to
Acton
be
Hilton.
known. But then you also had to look after props, I think.
We did, but not. It wasn't. We did, and it was a fantastic again liaison between yourself and the designer. So every time, or the prop buyer, and every time the director would say, "Oh, I need some flowers there, or I need this there, or that there." But it wasn't in rehearsal. Yes, obviously, but then when we got to the studio, that was taken over by the prop team and what have you, which I was quite pleased about because I wasn't that good at it. But one production I did, which was about alcoholism. Fabulous production, you know, and people who go to AA are known to be chain smokers often. Sorry, I shouldn't say that as a thing, but then it was, you know, you had to have something to fiddle
Everyone
with.
smoked there.
Well, no, exactly. But if you didn't have a glass to fiddle with, you'd have a cigarette. So, and again, this was doing it in the old way. But you had to make sure all the cigarettes that people were smoking were the right length for continuity. And I had a kind of tray full of different things, and I would give them to the actors and say, can you please change over at this point and this point and this point?
Yes.
And the set was awful. But I have got another smoking story.
Yes.
So I did Huis Clos, which is the French play by Sartre about, the person dies, and then for as long as people talk about them, it's like you're in hell, and as long as people talk about them, you are remembered. And it was Omar Sharif and Jeanne Moreau, both of whom were terrible chain smokers, and in rehearsals it was awful, because then you could smoke, it was before the no smoking. But you couldn't smoke in the studio by then. But of course they had to smoke off stage, and we couldn't afford for them to go, we didn't have the time for them to go back to their dressing room to smoke. So actually a dresser was employed literally to stand in the wings with an ashtray so they could run off and have a smoke and then go back on and what have you.
Really? But you could smoke on the set if it's
part of the thing.
Yeah.
And they were real cigarettes. Were they real? I think they were probably real cigarettes. I don't think the artificially ones came in for a few years. Yes. But they were lovely to work. I mean, they were chalk and cheese. They hated each other. Jeanne wanted to rehearse every single word. And Omar would leave rehearsal room and then go off clubbing and then ring all of us and say, you're coming out to dinner with me tonight. So as a new young AFM, I got taken to all the best restaurants in London, fully paid for. And Terence Stamp would be there, and Sir John Mills, because I did a play with Sir John and Omar. And then he'd go off gambling, I think, and then kind of stroll in the morning with bleary eyes and not really have rehearsed a word. But he was pin perfect when it came to recording.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me about memory with actors. Gielgud famously was not very good at remembering his lines, I think.
No, but you've just triggered a really old memory. I never had an actor that was like that. It was extraordinary. And I did spend a lot of time with them rehearsing their lines, at lunchtime, after work or whatever. But this is extraordinary memory, Ted Moult. He was quite famous for doing, not for the BBC obviously, an advert for double glazing. I think it was Everest or something. Yeah. And I think he was in something I did when I was in studio management, and you literally had to write his words on a card as huge as possible because you also couldn't see them. So that was a memory. Yes. I'd forgotten that.
Yes, and there were also, I seem to remember in the late 70s, some disastrous things where people put out unedited or incompletely edited tapes. There was a famous Sherlock Holmes thing, I think, where you could hear, on transmission. I mean, we were watching it at home, and you could hear the saying, "Oh, hold it there.
Yes.
Just go back and do this." Blah blah blah. No one had reviewed the tape properly.
Well, there was something called the cut key.
Mm-hmm.
In the days when you rehearsed all day and then recorded at night, and especially you'd have the cut key for the floor manager to speak to the gallery, and so you could cut the sound for a second and then say whatever you needed to say. And I can't remember his name now, but there was a famous moment when one of the floor managers had forgotten to put the cut key back off and expleted or said something, and that came over in the live transmission. Yes. Obviously, by the time I'm there wasn't quite so much live transmission, and that was, I think, probably more Ellie and obviously.
Yes.
Serious. Whereas plays, they were fully recorded and then went out.
Sure. Live was a very different business, wasn't it? I mean, it felt very different.
It did. I did very little live. I was a floor assistant when I was doing live, and that was, if we could either of us remember what Newsnight used to be called.
Not Tonight, was it? No.
Was it before? I can't remember. I know
Cliff Michelmore did
Cliff
Tonight.
Michelmore and Val Singleton also.
Yes, that was Tonight.
Did something.
Good Night and the next Tonight will be Tomorrow Night.
Tomorrow Night, yes. And that's when you had the rolling script and the bits of paper that would come down to the studio, and we're on the green bits of script now, and no, we're on the blue one now, and throwing them all over the place. Again, going back to Don Taylor, with Don Taylor, the sets all had to be built so that they were. And I seem to remember I was a floor assistant on Z cars, very early days, and the sets would be in line, as it were, so the cameras could leapfrog over. And of course, you had the cable bashers, But yeah, I mean, the camera crews were absolutely extraordinary, and Rod Taylor, who I worked with, and so many whose names I can't remember. Mutton, David Mutton. They just were fantastic, and their teams, and and we'd have the very long arm thing for the camera.
The crane.
The crane.
The crane,
yes.
or the heron.
No, the crane.
Yes.
I think it was. And you'd, on top of the pots, you'd have to move people out the way, and the skill was fantastic. And it's one of the things that annoys me about Strictly, of which I'm a huge fan, is that everyone thanks makeup and costume and lighting, but no one thinks to thank you the camera crew. And I think the work they do is extraordinary. And I know, like Rod Taylor, who sadly is no longer with us, the cameras were terribly heavy in those days. I mean, huge and massive, and they would get awful backache from it, moving them. And I think there was a time when they were asking for physiotherapy as a kind of standard, really, to help them. One of the nice things you said about being an AFM, and you're on at the beginning, but you're only on obviously from the read through, being in the office, obviously, before that, and then the read-through, and then the end of recording, that's it, finished. As an associate producer, you're on from the minute you get the script to cost it, to the minute it went out on transmission, and I absolutely loved that, because that's all changed. It's all different jobs now.
Yes. You saw it right the way through.
You saw it right the way through, and even to going, you'd go to the video editing and the colouring and the everything, and you'd be in the music studio, and it was just glorious.
Did you go out filming sequences?
Yes. And when I started, I didn't like it because I was very much a studio person. And then I became, drama plays became drama films, and then we were making films, and then I enjoyed doing films. But I missed the time in rehearsal, and I missed the closeness with the director, with the actors.
Yes,
really,
and the similarity with theatre, because people would do if it was a single camera drama, then they do one bit and then go back and do another bit and then do the reverses and all that sort of thing. Yeah, sure. So how long did that go on, working with drama?
The way the BBC worked, as you probably know, is you did your job, and then when you wanted to go up a level, you acted up, it was called, and then you became substantive.
Yes.
And then when you were substantive as that, you did a couple of years that, and then so I went from floor assistant, assistant floor manager, location manager, which I really enjoyed, because that you're kind of on your own or with the director, designer. And I did a film called Silent Twins, about identical black twins, which they've just made a feature film in America, and we were in Pembrokeshire. And I had a whole month there by myself, going around all the locations of where the girls had been. And I enjoyed that, because it was proper research. You got to know all the locals and could discuss the locations and what have you. And then go back and film it there. And it obviously meant a lot to them. Then from location manager to first assistant director, where you're either on the floor in the studio, which was the floor manager job in other departments, and then associate producer. So that was the kind of hardest learning curve, because a lot of stuff had gone on to computer by then. You had to do your budgeting. We in the old days, you'd write it down. You'd be told how much you had, and you'd write it in a book, and a ledger book, and then you'd cut off, you'd take off what you'd spent. But then it became something called movie magic budgeting, which I found terribly hard. So then you went to producer choice, whereas before your studio cost was below the line, so you didn't have to account for it. And then when we came into producer choice, you had to have, the value of any. What's that expression? Well, the cost of everything, the value of nothing.
You had to cost everything.
Everything.
And you had theoretically choice.
Yes.
To go outside or inside or wherever and choose the studio you wanted and everything else.
It was. I didn't like it.
No.
It made it very cutthroat. It made it. So, for example, for studio costs, if you had a big drama and you wanted to go into either TC1 or TC8, which were the very big studios, they'd have a certain cost. And I knew the woman who allocated, and she'd say, "Well, it'll have to be this cost." And I go, "Well, I can't afford that for 7 days. What can we come to accommodate?" Fortunately, we nearly always did, but I know that there were productions who would then go, "Oh, well, I'll go outside," and they'd go to wherever the studios were in the rest of London, at which point you'd have a studio either standing empty in Television Centre, which obviously isn't being paid for, or you would go to ITV Well, by then Channel 4, and it was, how ridiculous. We've got our own expertise here.
Yes.
And the two biggest areas that I disliked for outside directors, and they would encourage their producers to do, was our music studio was second to none, state of the art. It was the most up-to-date music studio, but it got to the point where directors would come and go, oh, well, I don't want to use the BBC one because they'll make this, I want to go to Wembley. Because Wembley had a very good music studio. Yeah. So we'd schlep all the way up to Wembley to the music studio. It was cold, half the stuff didn't work, you'd take longer. Really? And if you needed something last minute to put in, you couldn't. And the joy of having all the facilities in-house was you might complete a programme, a producer would ring me up, Ruth Caleb was good at this, she was a wonderful producer, and say, I don't think we got that end right. Any chance you could go and talk to Dave in VT and see if we can slot it in? And he would slot it in, and yes. You could say that's not real costing, but it worked.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there was an awful lot of people depending on the goodwill of others.
Yes.
And it worked.
Yes.
Because everyone was mucking in because
yes.
you were all BBC. Yeah, but as soon as you had to pay for everything,
no.
It's very tricky.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also about loyalty, because people felt imbued in the production. And I remember one of the biggest films that I did that I really didn't like, and I can't remember the name of the director, probably deliberately. He insisted on being outside for absolutely everything in post-production. So the editing rooms were horribly expensive and in the middle of central London and not very good. And then when it came to VT transfer, and it was all on film, we go in and the guy says, well, I've never handled film before. I was thinking, what are we doing here then? And it was not good.
Now, you didn't do any LE.
I did Some Mothers Do Have 'Em. I was seconded onto that. It was Sid Lotterby, who was kind of the top man he was producer-director, which is how they did it often there. But it was Michael Crawford, who was so charming. He was absolutely lovely. And there was a very family affair, really, of doing it, because everybody knew each other, and Sid being Sid would get the same lighting and the same costume and the same people. And it worked, because everyone knew each other. And we were on location it was one of the ones, it was an episode with blowing up of the chimneys in Bedford, which whoever the location manager were got, because Bedford were blowing up their brick chimneys, because it was at the time. And so we had it real for live. And it was Bedford and Cambridge, and it's a sequence where he's on a scooter, and he has to go across the water at Cambridge using the punts. So he goes across once, and then he goes, too many, take one out. So the stuntman takes one out, sign, and he goes over again. He says, no, there's still too many, because he did all his own stunts. And by the time they'd taken the many out, he was literally doing this. It was fantastic. He was a very shy man in lots of ways. Yes. He always felt that he'd got typecast and that people didn't recognise his acting talent, which, those of us who had come from theatre and drama did. Really.
Yes, because you tend to think of him as coming from that series.
Yes.
What about then the studio day when you have an audience there? How different is that?
I suppose it was like being in theatre, because, you've got to get it right. You don't have a second chance. There is that excitement of people coming in and sitting there, and that they're there hoping for the best, which is a lovely feeling, really.
Yes.
But probably I never got to more than AFM doing that. I was never first assistant or floor manager, which I think I'd have found quite scary.
What about, though, allowing for laughs, the time that laughs take? Did that affect the mechanics of the programme?
No, really, because everybody who worked on them, it was one of the advantages of pre-producer choice, that you had people you could have Deadwood, who, I've done this before, so I can phone it in, as we call it in the business, or you'd have the people who really know it, so they could sense it and feel it, and the vision mixer would be, with the director in the gallery, and the cameramen would know just how to work round it.
Vision mixers are very important, actually, as I found when I was directing.
Oh, yes.
You knew the ones who were good.
It did remind me of when you were on the book in theatre, you'd be sitting on the prompt side, which is stage right as you're looking at the theatre, stage left if you want. And you would be queuing up all the lighting, the sound, and prompt the actors, obviously. And a friend of mine became the DSM on, I think it was Coriolanus at the RSC. And it was the same as a girlfriend of mine who was the vision mixer on Old Grey Whistledown, where you'd have your board and they would make a simile of the board to take home at night to practice, because you had to work so fast and with multi-cameras or with multi-cues in theatre in the days before it was all computerised. So that's a kind of similar thing, I think, for the vision mixer role, Yeah. And when you watch all these things that we've been seeing lately, and I just love it. I think it's exciting. Yes. It was an exciting time.
It was exciting.
Very much so.
It was, I think, the 70s and 80s were the peak of television centre work.
Yes.
The whole.
Yes. I remember one show I did. It was a wonderful play. Oh, it was Beau Stratagem, which is restoration comedy. And it was a wonderful cast. And again, it was Don Taylor, and it was very complex. I mean, very complex to do. And one of the actors was a drinker, heavy drinker. Mm-hmm. And the producer came to me one meal break in the bar and said, "Tony hasn't come, can you go and get him?" And I said, "Me? I can't, I'm not going to go and, upset him." I said, "You go, you're the producer, you can go." So he had to go down and bring him up. Because it was a problem having the club as well.
Yes.
It's good side and it's bad side. And I do remember a wonderful, wonderful man, production manager, on Newsnight, before it was called Newsnight, who did drink rather too much, and it brought about his demise.
Tell me about temperament.
Temperament.
With actors or with producers and directors. Difficult people.
Well, amazingly, the people I had most respect for were not difficult. Alan Bedell, who maybe a lot of people might remember, he was the most extraordinary actor. And he told me one day in rehearsal that he'd heard about me from his daughter, because I'd worked with his daughter, Sarah Bedell, twice, who was just the best actress to have. I mean, she never, just no problem at all. She'd be laughing and joking in the wings, and then she'd get on fully professional, know all her lines, and then come off. And when you'd call her to change a call, that was no problem at all. She was just lovely. And first day of rehearsal with Alan, I'd go out and I'd say, I'm Ruth Mayorcas. He said, "Oh yes, I've heard all about you from my daughter." And we were talking one day, and he said, "I parachuted into Belsen, and he was one of the first people to see."
Really?
Yeah, extraordinary man. He was.
Alan Bedell.
He was so fantastic, and he always said he was very ugly, and he was in a play when I was a school child, and I remember him so well in that. Of course, it's gone. Where there is a line where he has to look at a mirror and say how he looks like a pantomime dame or something. So people like him were fantastic. Eric Porter was absolutely marvellous. Peter Vaughan, the people who really knew their stuff, and a lot of them had also come up in theatre.
Yes, they were theatre actors.
Yes,
rather than actors who then went into television.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they had a discipline. I remember being on film location. It was my last film. My son was there because we were in Spain, and I couldn't leave him in England for a month by himself, or even I wouldn't leave him. So I took him with, and an actor absolutely screamed at me about his car one day, about it not being there, or I'd asked him to share a car with somebody else. Why wouldn't you? And my son was terribly, terribly upset by that.
Really?
He was very upset. He said,
Yes.
"How can they be so rude to you, Mummy?"
Yes.
But Ken Branagh, you see, who I adored and did a wonderful Shadow of a Gunman with. One's first job, as associate producer in a way, having got them all there and everything, was to check how they were going to get home. And I said, "Oh, what time would you like your car?" And he said, "Don't be silly, I've got my own car. I'm not going to charge the production to be taken home." And, that's as it should have been, really, often.
Yes.
But, I mean, he'd have a driver who would come and get him anyway.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
So there were actors who could be difficult about that kind of thing. But often you knew that they had other issues, if you know what I mean.
Yes, quite.
So, yes. being a theatre person, I was quite snobby and I loved doing the plays. And then I'd suddenly get told that, well, there isn't anything available, you have to go to Angels, which I especially didn't like. But that was recording up in Birmingham, and we rehearsed everything in 5 seconds flat. But I was sent on Doctor Who, and that probably was my first time away. And it was in South Wales, and my father worked in the steel industry in North Wales, and his very best friend was very, very South Wales from the valleys. And my father told him where we were going, and he said, oh, I know that hotel very well. I wonder if she'll get the 4-poster bedroom. So I turn up as this new person, and there was something about being on filming. If you didn't have a partner... So obviously most people on location would go to their room to phone their husband, their wife, their child. And when you're young and single, you haven't got anyone to phone. So you'd kind of feel a bit lonely. But the funny thing was I went up to my room and I had the 4-poster bed. I could not believe it. So I did make a phone call to my parents saying, no, not really. But Tom Baker was quite similar to Michael Crawford in a way. He was quite shy in some ways. And also, again, a slight resentment of having been kind of typecast in this. And he would say, well, of course, I'm ex-RSC and I've done this, darling, and what have you. And Tom would spend the whole weekend either going to the cinema, he'd go morning, afternoon, evening. So on Monday morning, we'd talk about what film he'd been to see. And in between that, he would be doing Fate openings with the Doctor Who costume. So they had to have 2 or 3 because he'd wear the costume the whole weekend, and then it would come in all a bit dirty and shabby, and the famous scarf and what have you. But so we went to eat at a restaurant that's a pub in the middle of nowhere called the Walnut Tree, which in later years the BBC did a whole documentary about failing restaurants and turning them round. And weirdly, this was one of those pub restaurants that was failing and then was turned around. But in those days it was terribly successful. And we get there and I'm, young, new, not much money. And I open the menu, I think, I can't afford this. I can't afford any of this. And he looked at me and said, what would you like? And I said, well, I'd quite like oysters. Have oysters, I'll pay for them. So he was lovely.
Oh, lovely.
He was lovely. Yeah. And the director was Pennant Roberts, who also sadly died not that long ago, relatively young. And he was Welsh. And again, it's another one of the driving stories. I was driving thinking, I've got no idea, because the signs are in Welsh, in that part of Wales. And he said, would you like me to help you? And I said, oh, yes, please, I haven't got a clue. But we had a lovely, lovely time. And that does, if you don't mind, I'm jumping around as I do.
That's all right, that's fine.
So I did this extraordinary film in Ireland called How Many Miles to Babylon. Maura Armstrong directing, who'd been a documentary director and then a very, very well known. She's still alive, lives in Brook Green. I still see her in her 90s. She was directing, and it was in Southern Ireland, County Wicklow. And Daniel Day-Lewis, it was one of his first film roles. And my job again was to drive him. I had to drive one of the oldest Jeeps. Real old Jeeps with 2 gear sticks from London to wherever, Holyhead, and then across to Dunleary, I think it was then. And literally you have to take your hands off the steering wheel to do the 2 gear sticks when you're going uphill to get down all the gears. And I loved it. I had a great time. Anyway, so I drive and I get on the boat, and it is the night that one of my nephews was born. So I get a call to go to the bridge. Ruth Mayorcas come to the bridge, and it was my brother-in-law to say, oh, we've just got a new nephew. So I remember the date. Anyway, I get over to Ireland, and we're in County Wicklow. And again, no signposts anywhere. And if you ask any Irishman how to get around, it was either you don't start from here, the Terry Wogan joke, or you go to that pub, and then you go to that pub. And I was driving Daniel Day-Lewis, and I was so lost, and it was 5:30 in the morning, and I'm sweating, and he said, I'll do it for you. So, it was lovely, the feeling that you had with a lot of these actors. But we were filming in County Wicklow, and they dug all these trenches and filled them with water, and we had the local fire brigade with a Bowser, and the soldiers who were from the local job centre, all the extras, had to wear these serge uniforms. And they would be put into tents at night with blowers to dry them off. so the soldiers could put them on dry in the morning. And then Moira Armstrong would say, put the Bowsers on. So these poor, out of work but being paid guys would have to go through and get soaking wet again. And we had a wonderful caterer, an Irish caterer who was quite renowned in those days. And we did have a hot toddy tent. So they would have a tent where literally they would go and make hot toddies for you, which were quite fantastic.
Presumably the Jeep that you were driving was a prop, was it? I mean,
yes.
It was
Yes, no. It was either, I can't remember if it was a prop or that because of where we were filming, we actually did need it as a location car. And there's a lovely, lovely grip called Ian Buckley, Irish fellow, absolutely lovely. I'd met him first in studios and then he became a grip. And he was on it. And I think I did tip it into a lake one day. I did. I judged reversing it or something. So... the breadth of what we did in television, again, was quite extraordinary, and I just
it was a very privileged existence, really, wasn't it? In a way, and also we sailed through all these. If you were being paid by the BBC, we sort of sailed through these difficult economic times without feeling, that it was awful.
We did, and obviously you had a regular paycheck.
Yes.
And you knew that you were contributing to your pension, which even at kind of 25, 30, seemed quite important then.
Yes.
But we did work very hard. I mean, I've done all the jolly stories. We did work very, very hard. And the last film I did do, which we will come to, we were in the desert near Almeria in southern Spain and starting ridiculously early and finishing ridiculously late. And people did it. But even by the 80s, you heard people were going to Thames Television, people were going to LWT, people were going to other and being paid a huge amount more. But it was like being, I suppose, in the teaching profession or in the nursing profession. You were kind of embraced at the BBC.
Yes. And you felt secure.
And you did feel secure. And I compare it, my father worked for British Steel and, it was that kind of being part of a company and they looked after you. And with all the clubs that they had, so you met people outside, you had to pay for them. There was nothing free. But it was a loyalty and a love that I think gave very good work.
Yes.
And when people complained about the dead work, I think that was poor management. I don't think you can complain about the BBC, which people have a tendency to do. And it was shocking when John Burt came. Oh, that was what I was going to tell you. So when I was a production manager and John Burt had come in and it was now we had to cost for absolutely everything, they suddenly decided that sound in the studio was overmanned is the word, right. So someone from either Pete Mowat McClintock or something WP, what were they called?
Oh, Price
Waterhouse Cooper. Came and followed me for a couple of weeks, trailed me. So rehearsals, then the thing. And at the end of it, he came to me, he said, I can see where we can save money. We don't need anyone in the gallery. And I said, well, how are you going to mix the sound then? Oh, well, surely the people on the floor can do that. And it was like, because they wanted to reduce everything to as much as possible.
But didn't fully understand.
But didn't actually understand the craft. And I do think sound is one of the crafts.
Crucial.
Well, it was crucial, but it sadly went the way of America. So if you did any post-production, you had to get any of the cast in to do
lip syncing
and all the rest of it. They would be individually mic'd. And then when you started going to the outside places, they would do it like in America, where they were all around one mic. So it never worked properly.
No.
So people are turning their televisions up, and when you had transferred it to ready for broadcast, of course you're in the most perfect setting, which people at home aren't. And I think there's been, you can save money, but then what do you destroy?
Yes.
In the doing it, really.
If you watch television nowadays, what's your opinion of television drama?
I get very addicted to a certain thing, but like everyone, I think. I want to call it Thin Blue Line, but it was Line of Duty.
Line of Duty, yeah.
I think Line of Duty was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Partly the music, because the music really does, like the one about the deaths off the cliffs down in on the south coast.
No, I know what you mean. Yes,
it's one word. Broadchurch.
Broadchurch.
We get there together.
Yeah, we get there.
That. But they then become formulaic, unfortunately, and because one's worked, on scripts, you can see and you can tell, even at the end of a new 6-parter, the 6th episode, whether they've started discussing the next series. Whereas I think in our day, things were nicely rounded off and finished. And also, if it was written like it was often in plays, obviously, we were either doing the real plays or modern plays, and people knew how to use the red pen, as we called it. They knew how to cut out extraneous words or things, and I think often scripts could do with a proper script editor.
What about the use of music generally? Do you find it overbearing?
I tend to. My partner is hard of hearing and Dutch, so we do have the subtitles on a lot, and I increasingly will put the subtitle on, even though I've got pin-sharp hearing, just because I miss things, and I think they're mumbled, and the lighting is often too dark, especially in certain productions.
Let's just turn towards the end of your career, though. Okay. Because how did you come to leave the BBC?
I was a single mother, son of 8, and I managed him throughout. I had, very good childcare, very good neighbours, and it was fine. This slightly goes into my views on children and bringing up children. When he was very little, as long as the person loved him and cared for him and was safe, that was fine. But by the time he was 6, he was becoming his own person, and it mattered to me. He went to the local state primary school, to which my father had been, and it really mattered to me what kind of upbringing he was having. And there was a tendency for all, in Chiswick, I'm sure it happened over, the local nannies to kind of get together in gaggles and they'd sit and watch Neighbours with the children. I certainly wasn't having that and that kind of thing, and EastEnders. And I was conscious that I was losing my grip. I mentioned Movie Magic budgeting, and we then had Movie Magic scheduling. Now, in the old days of scheduling, which I loved, you have a camera card.
Oh, the
PA.
Well, the production assistant.
Yes. And they, we all sat in the office together, and we'd break down the script, and they would do it in line, and you would cut it out, and then you'd use paper clips. And when it came to doing the schedule, you'd spread them all out on your floor, and you'd clip them all together and move them around. And it was your job as the first assistant director to do that. It then started to become the job of the associate producer to do the breakdown, everything, with no help whatsoever. And you had to do it on this Movie Magic. First of all, it was a board where you put little thin paper strips in, but you'd have to have typed that all in first. And I will be the very first to admit I'm a hopeless typist, and what have you. And I didn't like this thing of saying to a costume designer, "Will you do this for $900 a week?" And they go, "Well, no, actually, it's not, and will you do this number of hours?" So then the top team in drama would be saying, "We have to go outside," or the director would come in and say, "I want so and so," and I didn't like that. I felt I was stabbing in the back my friends, the people that I'd known for years, and the people I knew were good at their jobs. And over that time, people were leaving anyway. The good people were leaving because they were a bit fed up with it, and I was put onto this very big film, All the King's Men. Wonderful producer, young producer, whose father was Christopher Neame. So Gareth Neame, lovely man. He was tough as nails, but he was fantastic. And I was struggling by then. My son was 8, and I was really struggling with not spending much time at home. And it was a big production. First World War. I did the budget at 3 million. It was kind of cut down to 2.5, 2. And instead of Turkey, we used Spain, and we were filming in Sandringham. So I had to take him out of school to take him to Sandringham for a month, put him into the local school there, which was quite fun. And I didn't know the first AD at all. I didn't know the cameraman. I didn't know... This sounds like a child complaining. But I had no comfort there. I had a makeup artist that I knew and liked. Everyone else were from somewhere else. And
this was the casualisation of the industry, really.
Yes. And it got to the point, I mean, for example, we did the tech recce in the desert in Spain, and the lighting, the gaffer, who again was an outsider, said, "Well, I need a Jenny and 4 men." I said, "You can't use a Jenny in the desert." The lighting cameraman kind of looked at me as if, "Well, who are you?" So we budgeted for all of that, because they wanted to pay their men all the way through. And that's where I didn't like but I didn't have that kind of power that I would have liked to have said, well, you can do it with 3 men and a few of, those things they use in the desert.
Yeah.
Reflectors.
Oh,
reflectors, yes.
They're much cheaper than generators.
Well, I know, and of course we didn't use the Jenny in the desert because you couldn't get it. And it was hard work. It was over hard work. And I'm not afraid of hard work, but I wasn't up to it. I wasn't up to it. I cheerfully admit I wasn't up to it.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful senior person looking after me, Geoffrey Paget, who I did also work for a lot. He would be an executive person doing the money. And he helped me a lot, and he bailed me out quite a bit in terms of, why don't you do it this way? Why don't you do it that way? I mean, one of the things I'd budgeted, which was completely my fault, was I'd budgeted at the end of filming for the entire crew to drive back on a Sunday and catch the Monday boat. And someone said, well, we can't do that. We're not allowed to drive in Spain at the weekend. And I hadn't even... And to this day, HGVs don't drive in Europe. Really? On Saturday or Sunday. So. They have quite strict rules, unlike us.
Really?
So I had to have a whole raft more of overnights and more money, and I had to find it from somewhere. So I wasn't very good. I wasn't very good at it. I didn't like the accountant. She got her husband to be the assistant accountant. He was a carpenter, not an accountant. And I fell apart.
The whole thing was falling apart.
The whole thing was falling apart. And I came back to London, and it was the time when redundancies were being offered. And I just thought, actually, I can't do this anymore.
Right.
I will go. And it was sad, but it was the right time.
Yeah. And do you still keep a love of theatre? Do you still go? Or is it sort of tarnished it a bit?
No, I do have a love of theatre, and I do go to theatre, not as much as I did. I mean, I took my son to theatre a lot when he was very little, and it is, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool state school person, and he went to Belmont Primary School where my father went, and he went to Chiswick School where my father went, and I took him to theatre, and I just felt that often people who were going to the private schools, they let the private schools do the things that you could do as a parent.
As a parent,
So that's my kind of strong socialist views on that one. So but I love a film, huge love of film. And for example, the first year I stopped working, or the year after, I went to almost every film at the London Film Festival. I would sit there morning, afternoon and evening to go to films. I think I've got slightly tarnished of that just because I don't think they're as good as anymore. I don't think the red pen comes out often enough. We always used to say in television they use the same actors over and over again, but I think that's very much happening now.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen Living with Bill Nighy, and I just think, oh, Bill, really? They've traded on those little quirks, and it's actually
the funny laugh with the snort.
Yes. I mean, it just very quickly going back. I mean, one of the things we've sketched over. I did one of the Alan Bennett monologues.
Oh, did you?
With Stephanie Cole, and utterly tragic, really tragic. I couldn't bring myself to watch because they did them all again, and I couldn't bring myself to watch it. But it's where she's living on her own, and her son wants to sell the flat, and Stephanie Cole is one of those people you can watch reading the phone directory, and bit by bit. The scenery disappears because he's made her sell all sorts of different things, and then she's left in this kind of empty room, and then he's made her go into a home so that he can make the money out of the flat. Working on that and rehearsing on that was just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Soldiering On, it was called.
Soldiering On.
Yes, because most people watch the one cracker under the famous one where she's dropped the cracker and she can't get it.
Yes.
But we again, because the same crew, you had a different director, but the same crew tended to do it, and it was just wonderful because they all knew it so well. It was brilliant.
Yes.
I've got to do one very. I'm sure I've talked for hours.
No, it's fine.
But you haven't mentioned. We talked about the club and North Acton Rehearsal Rooms Restaurant. 2 stories. One is when I did work with Omar Sharif. Brenda Reid said, "Could you go and ask Mr. Sharif where he'd like to have his lunch?" So I was an associate producer by then. So I go into where he had a green room at the rehearsal rooms. And I said, "Oh, excuse me, Omar, where would you like lunch?" And he said, "Well, where are you having lunch?" And I said, "Upstairs." He said, "Well, I'll have it upstairs then." I mean, he didn't want any being looked after. He was quite happy to just kind of muck in. And I think, you asked me about temperament.
Yes.
Often some actors were treated with kid gloves, and therefore they always behaved as if they needed to. And often they weren't. They were just like you and me, but
Yes.
were in front of camera.
Yes.
And obviously you gave them the respect for that very much. But like Elizabeth Spriggs, I mean, when we did Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, it was John Caird, who's a theatre director you may know, did Les Mis. And Elizabeth Spriggs was playing, whoever she was playing, and David Calder was Falstaff, and the scene where he dies, she just walked on. She'd been having a chat with me in the wings. She just walked on. She did. It was a 4 or 5 minute speech. Had us all in tears. And it was pitch perfect. Didn't have to do a retake, nothing. She was just fantastic. Ronnie Pickup was like that as well. There was some wonderful people. But there was the second floor restaurant, the waitress service.
Yes.
And I remember when I first was a kind of a newbie-ish and I decided to go, and I was sitting at a table, and one of the most fearsome of the PAs, because they could be quite fearsome, the PAs, that's my seat. Because she always sat in the same seat in waitress service. And I thought, how am I supposed to know this? It was funny.
Oh,
very
funny. Yeah.
Very funny.
Yeah, good. So we've heard how you left. We've heard how you
got there.
We've heard what you did, and I think we've more or less covered it, haven't we?
I think so.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think that was really very interesting.
Well, thank you. It is lovely to go back in and remember a lot of these, the people, because it is about the people, which was phenomenal.
Yeah.
So
it's always the people,
you.
isn't it? Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Okay.